Welcome to this module within the Policy Development course. This module is titled Library Policies, an Overview. I'm Bonnie McEwen, the consultant for the Northwest District Office of the State Library. You're welcome to contact me with any follow-up questions regarding this class. You can refer back to this slide, or you can find me from the Contact Us link on the State Library's website. In this module, we'll look at the need for public libraries to develop thoughtful public policies, along with the role that library boards and directors play in that process. We'll look at the connection between policies and standards, and we'll conclude with a preview of sorts, a look at the 4 parts of a policy as developed by the Public Library Association in a book titled Policies for Results. Iowa's public library boards are governing boards, which gives them a great deal of decision-making authority over the library's operations. One major area of board authority is to exercise their responsibility to develop thoughtful public policy. In fact, policy development is one of 5 major responsibilities for Iowa's library boards. More about that coming up. Many standards have policy implications. More about that coming up. In terms of ethical and legal issues, there are several surrounding policy development: open meetings, equal opportunity employment, handicap accessibility, confidentiality of library records are just a few of the legal and ethical issues surrounding library policies. We'll talk more about these legal issues in the 4th module of this policies course. As we move through our lives as consumers and in our own library work, we know that every other business we frequent and all other services we enjoy have their own rules and regulations in place. Well-crafted library policies demonstrate thoughtful and competent business practice. It makes library boards and directors look proficient and on top of the issues. You'll be right in step with other agencies in the public sector and with the business community. Now here's one more point behind the importance of policies. It's an opportunity for public education. Here's something to consider. As you promote your library services and programming, do you also provide accompanying policies, maybe in the way of flyers or fact sheets? For instance, when people apply for a library card for the first time, do you give them a short policy statement in the form of a fact sheet that explains their library card and the privileges that come with it? Do you have fact sheets, really mini policies, near your public computers, informing people about the use of library computers and internet access? Do you have the library's meeting room policies posted in the meeting room itself as a reminder of the expectations for using that space? And do you have all these same policies I've mentioned posted on the library's website? The 4th module in this policies course will bring us back to this suggestion of using policies as an opportunity for public education. Remember the phrase administrative authority. That describes Iowa's public library boards. Administrative authority includes these 5 areas of board responsibility. From hiring the library director to approving and monitoring the budget, there's developing and adopting policies, including planning for the future and evaluating service and advocating for advancement. Even though the board delegates the day-to-day management to the director, the board still needs to retain its responsibility to ensure that the library succeeds and prospers. In exercising that responsibility, Iowa's public library boards have these 5 primary roles showing on this slide, and certainly developing and adopting policies is one of those roles, and certainly an important one. Library boards must be mindful that they adopt public policy for a public service. They should take care to avoid writing policies that are reactionary or punitive. Instead, policy development should keep community interests at the forefront. Once adopted by the board, library staff work to carry out those policies and communicate them fairly and consistently to library users. So we've established that library boards have a great deal of authority over the library's operation. That's called administrative authority in Iowa. And some of those responsibilities include public policy development. So let's talk about the board's role in the policy development process. Library boards are a public body, and they must be in compliance with the Iowa's open meetings laws. When boards are in the position to hire a new director, they must be in compliance with state and federal employment law. Ethical compliance means several things. One example of ethical compliance is defending intellectual freedom. Another example is being good stewards of the library's budget, being always mindful that the library's budget comes from public tax dollars. Another ethical action that the board can exercise is being consistent in meeting attendance, taking care not to be absent more than they are present at library board meetings. And in terms of understanding the broader implications, I look at it like this. I think there's a tendency to write policies in the aggravation of the moment. If staff one day are very frustrated by loud and continuous cell phone conversations going on in the library, they might propose to the management, and management might propose to the board that we need a policy on no cell phones in the library. But that really is not in keeping with how people use personal devices and cell phones. They're everywhere throughout our day. And so that would be doing a policy or adopting a policy in the heat of the moment, understanding the broader implications of how people use and interact with public libraries is an important understanding for the board. And then finally, the board approves policy philosophy and regulations. I'll have a bit more to say about that later. Now, in looking at the director's role, a good way to make the policy process more efficient is for the director to bring issues to the board's attention in 1 month, allowing for good discussion, and then for the director to bring back a policy draft in the next month for the board to consider. Library directors act as technical advisors to the board, having done preliminary research and background reading, maybe having posed questions to state library staff, and then sharing what they learn with the board. When the board revises policies or writes new ones, the director's role then is to share those policy changes with staff, providing time for staff discussion and understanding. Speaking of staff, it's often been said that one of the best ways to update job descriptions is to ask the person doing the job. Ask for that input, for the first-hand knowledge from the person doing the job. Well, that same idea applies here. Staff should be free to make suggestions for improvements, to make suggestions for policy changes, certainly to ask questions about current policy practice. They need to understand the policy development process and whose responsibility is whose. But it's really important for the staff to feel that they have a role to play here and to understand their role. Staff are the ones on the front lines. They're the ones on the service desks. They are the ones most frequently and daily interacting with patrons. they will hear from patrons if they are frustrated by rules and regulations, if patrons find some kind of rule or regulation too constrictive, too awkward, or difficult to understand. It's important for staff to relay those patron conversations to management, to have those discussions at a staff meeting level, and then if warranted for the director or management to take those concerns to the library board. But it's also incumbent upon the staff to explain the policies that the board has adopted, to explain the reasoning and those policies fairly, and to try to implement them consistently. In your experience in working with library policies, have you ever wondered if there is a role for city government? Might there be a role, if any, in decisions that affect the library staff and patrons? Well, at the State Library, we believe yes. We believe that the city government could logically have a role to play. Yes, to some extent. Now, not nearly to the same extent as the responsibility that library boards have. But policy decisions that have been made by the city for other city workers in other departments might very logically apply to public library staff and might be very advantageous for the library to follow. This slide suggests some areas in which the city might have some very logical influence over library policies. For instance, in the areas of HR, salary scales, and benefits. If your city has adopted a salary scale for other city workers, if the city has determined vacation and sick leave benefits for other city workers, then it could certainly be advantageous for the library staff to be a part of those HR policies. Most cities have adopted policies for expense reimbursement, like the amount of mileage that is paid to city workers when they travel on business to training or conferences. If that hasn't been addressed by the library, it should be, but you can first look to City Hall to see if those expense reimbursement policies have already been determined for other departments. Cities have likely determined their holiday closings well in advance of the holiday. They have likely determined their process for inclement weather closings. So these are logical policy coordinations between the library and city government. Let's talk now about the connection of policies and standards. As you continue in your library career, we will forever be encouraging you to be mindful of the connection between library operations and library standards. The State Library puts forth service standards for Iowa's public libraries. The document you see on the slide, In Service to Iowa, Public Library Standards, is an important resource for boards, directors, and staff. On this slide, I'll call your attention to standard number 7, which is required of participating libraries at the basic Tier 1 level. The library adopts 4 required written policies, and those broad categories are circulation, collections, personnel, and internet use. We'll look at each of these in turn. Now, the next 4 slides provide a summary of typical elements within those 4 required policies. I have not included detailed explanation of these subtopics in this module. Time just doesn't allow for that. But what you can do is compare and contrast these points against your own library policies. See what matches up. You'll likely find topics that your library has addressed. You may find topics that your library hasn't addressed. So compare these points of a circulation policy against your own. See where revisions might might be needed? Have you addressed who are eligible borrowers to receive full library service? Those will be your own community residents who are taxpayers whose taxes are supporting your city library. Have you defined who are the open access customers that your library serves and what eligibility is extended to open access patrons? Your circulation policy will include the length of loan periods for books and other formats, how people can renew materials and for how long, if there are fines and fees, what people can expect to pay if they lose or damage library materials. Interlibrary loan typically shows up in the circulation policy, along with the explanation of what can people expect if there is equipment that they can borrow from the library and actually take out of the building. So again, these policy points under a circulation policy and the others that we will soon look at are really just an opportunity for you to compare and contrast your own circ policy against this sample. Feel free to compare, contrast, see where revisions might be needed, and then feel free to contact your district consultant for further advice. District consultants are happy to provide policy training for staff and as board education. Here are some common points considered in a collection policy. The criteria behind which you base your purchase decisions. Public library collections should be fair and balanced and have quite a range of thought and opinion, but they also should be based on community needs and interests. If your library is large enough to have staff who can divide out the responsibility of making those collection decisions and purchases, for instance, maybe your youth services staff are selecting and purchasing the materials for the children's department. How does your library handle gifts and donations from people? What about collection evaluation? How often do you do inventory, and what criteria do you apply toward weeding the collection, toward making those decisions about materials to keep versus materials to withdraw? And once withdrawn, how do you dispose of the withdrawn materials? Intellectual freedom statements typically show up in a collection policy. These are very common aspects of a personnel policy. You would likely have job descriptions for all positions, some mention made of salary and benefits, the expectation for director and staff education. There's expense reimbursement again that I mentioned. Job performance reviews often shows up in a personnel policy. Job evaluation reviews are typically done annually. And what about grievance procedures? Health and safety in the workplace. There's holiday and inclement weather closings again, typical to show up in a personnel policy. And finally, this is the fourth of those 4 required policies, required at a Tier 1 level, that library boards must include. And this is the Internet use policy. So very commonly found in an internet use policy is the fact that the library protects patron confidentiality. Patrons who are using public computers, those search histories are kept confidential. Does your library take a stance on filtering software? That is, software that filters internet websites. What about public behavior that's expected while people are using the library's computers? Can people who sign up for time on library's computers be expected to have a time limit? What might that be? 30 minutes? Maybe 1 hour? Can those time limits be extended if no one else is waiting? Those are all very common points to include in an internet use policy. Now, here's another standard connected to policy development. You'll notice that this one is not required, like the other one was. This is standard number 9. This is not required, but it is a great suggestion that the board adopts at least 2 additional policies from a wide assortment of policy topics. The book, In Service to Iowa, Public Library Standards, that document gives you a good listing of what those other additional policy categories could be. And on the slide, you see some of them. The board could adopt policies on bulletin boards and displays, meeting rooms, holiday hours, inclement weather closings, library programming, and the use of social media in the library by the staff and patrons alike. Again, there are many more samples of additional policy topics to be found in the standards book. Now, the next 2 slides offer 2 very good and authoritative sources for finding sample library policies. The first is from the American Library Association. ALA is the oldest and largest library association in the world, dating back to 1876. One crucial role for ALA is to advocate for all types of libraries, whether public, school, or colleges, helping to raise awareness that libraries are a public good and essential service. Another vital role for ALA is to provide a national and unified defense of intellectual freedom. And defending intellectual freedom at the local level is a critical advocacy role for library boards, requiring, again, thoughtful public policy. So I direct you to ALA's website, the address you see circled on the slide, as a great source to find intellectual freedom statements, intellectual freedom policies, and interpretations that your library board can review and endorse. This source for sample policies is thanks to a partnership between the Colorado State Library and ARSL. That acronym stands for the Association for Rural and Small Libraries. This is a compilation of policy topics contributed by library practitioners, largely in Colorado, but some are there from other small rural libraries elsewhere in the country. This is a really rich compilation and varied compilation of policies. Among the topics you'll find here are policies on working with volunteers in the library, using meeting rooms, expected patron behavior, and lending wireless hotspots. That and much more found on the CLIC website. CLIC standing for the Colorado Library Consortium, the address you see circled on the slide. The Colorado Library Consortium is the equivalent of the Colorado State Library. Before wrapping up this module, I want to take a minute to preview 2 other modules that are coming up in this policy development course. One approach to policy development is to use the ideas from this book you see on the slide. This book comes from the Public Library Association. It's titled Creating Policies for Results. And while it's not a new book from the Public Library Association, it does represent a fresh way of thinking about writing policies. For example, these are the 4 parts to a policy, and the writing of it should ideally begin with a discussion about service philosophy. Why does the library provide a service or a program? That discussion lays the groundwork for writing policy. The board needs to be squarely involved in that philosophy discussion. Think of regulations as the rules of the road. What do library users need to know in order to use library services most effectively? Procedures are those things that the staff needs to know and do. Procedures are staff work routines. And finally, guidelines. Think of guidelines as best practice. Guidelines offer the allowance to staff to make exceptions to the rules, but for good reason. To make exceptions for the rules for good customer service reasons. In the next 2 modules within this policy course, we will take each of these 4 parts of a policy and we will apply the 4 parts to interlibrary loan service. That will be our example that's coming up. But for now, to wrap up this module on library policies and overview, thoughtful public policies should be developed through study, input, and discussion, involving the library director, the staff, the board, and always considering the safety and the welfare of your community residents. It should establish service regulations and rules of conduct that can be readily understood by staff and users alike. Thoughtful public policy must be consistent with local, state, and federal law. And finally, thoughtful public policy must ensure equal treatment for all ages and races, providing a framework for the consistent delivery of services and free of discrimination. This concludes this learning module within the Policy Development course. This was the learning module, Library Policies and Overview. Good luck as you continue the endorsement program, and be sure to reach out to us at the State Library with any questions.